Hey fellas, welcome back to another Chapter E tutorial. This time we're going to be talking about the weather. Now we're only going to be focusing on weather in the temperate zone, basically Europe. PTO and desert will touch on their weather charts, but we're not going to go into depth on them. We'll leave that for videos on those two regions. And finally, we'll talk about some subarctic conditions that came out because of the Hakapale Finnish module. So let's get into it. So in the top center is the temperate weather chart that you normally reflect on in Chapter E. This is the one that most players use if it's not provided by SSR. And on the right, you can see the one that comes with Hakapale. It gives you subarctic weather chart information for those regions. Again, the desert and the Pacific, those two other charts, we're not going to talk about. Again, they can have quite diverse results, and they're best saved for their own videos, which we'll do on those theaters when we end up getting to them. Big thing to remember about weather generation is that it does not take precedence over the environmental conditions or EC. So, for example, if you were to roll snow as an EC condition, it does not necessarily activate the E3.7 snow rules, which we're going to be touching on, especially if the weather chart or the SSR indicates that the weather is clear. You just apply the diral modifiers for the EC conditions. That's the only thing I can worry about for that. So let's look at low visibility first. This one is one of the rules that applies in many scenarios, again, for a variety of reasons. Typically, it's only used to describe weather conditions and any related camouflage when the following exists. So you have night, fog, mist, rain, and or falling snow. If any of those five conditions exist, and or if you're using things like winter camouflage, then you have low visibility hindrances, which are similar to LOS hindrances, except they are cumulative with the latter, regardless of range. They do not negate FFMO or interdiction, so you still have to worry about those two factors. They will not affect placement or any attack of residual fire, so it's not going to be impacting that. And it does not prevent concealment loss, with the exception, of course, winter camouflage, which we'll cover briefly in a second. So first up is fog and or mist. Now, you don't have both, you have one or the other. Typically, if it's not specified by SSR, you make a die roll. On a 1 to 5, you have mist, and on a 6, you have fog. You can see on the left the fog level chart, and that applies to all hexes and levels below the indicated one. So, for example, if you were to roll a 3, level 1 and lower hexes would be impacted by fog, and of course, higher level hills and such would not be affected. Now, the density of these hexes is treated much in the way like smoke. So, you roll on a subsequent table, and if it's a +1, +2, or +3, it's like having that kind of smoke or dispersed smoke in effect, and the same kind of rules apply. The exceptions, of course, is that mist and fog do not drift, and any fog die roll modifier is halved for fire within the same location. So if you have really heavy fog, say +3 on a level 1, and you're firing at units inside your hex, so your triple point blank fire, you would actually have that and then round up to a 2 vice +3 when you're shooting. Just to indicate, obviously, that you're fighting in the same location. Now, when you have breeze effects, such as heavy or mild breezes, they will decrease the fog applicably, like you can see there. And the only other thing to remember is obviously air support cannot be used against targets in the fog. However, you can use anything higher elevations in buildings and or in on hills, for example. Regarding mist, typically you can see the chart there on the bottom right. That's from the Kampf Piper SSR card. And when it says very light, that's much in the way that the mist rules are indicated. And when it comes to rain, you can look at the light mist. So if you have trouble remembering groups of 6 hexes, there's a handy chart on the Kampf Piper SSR that will list everything out for you. But basically, that's how it works. You have a +1 per 6 hex range beyond the first 6 hexes. So for every multiple of 6, there's an extra +1, and it continues ad infinitum. The exceptions, of course, are specific collateral attacks, OBA, and residual firepower. For obvious reasons, those are not impacted by any of the mist rules. And mist is always in effect whenever rain is in effect. So let's talk about rain then. Rain only occurs when it's overcast weather. Overcast weather on the weather chart indicates the presence of storm clouds. And a rain is not in effect unless an SSR specifies until sometime in the wind change die roll you roll a 10 or more, and or if it's raining you roll a 3 or less, in which case the rain would stop. Now if it's already raining and you again roll a 10 plus on the next wind change die roll, the rain just increases to heavy, but it does not go up any higher. The most you can get is heavy rain, in which case you would have a +1 low visibility hindrance between 1 and 6x's. You would have a +2 at 6 to 12, and it would increase from there. Again, much like that Kamkruf Piper chart, every multiple of 6, you get an extra +1. Now, regardless of the intensity, if you roll a 3 or 2, the rain will cease. So if it's heavy or if it's normal rain, it doesn't matter, it's going to cease. EC will always become wet for the duration of the scenario following the rain. So even if it only lasts one turn, EC conditions become wet. The only smoke that can exist during rain is that emanating from a blaze, or if it's entirely within a building. That smoke can fill the entire hex, but it's not subject to any kind of drift. Obviously, the rain's going to keep it down. It also impacts movement, especially going uphill. If you can imagine, it makes it slipperier. All units must spend an extra movement factor, or for vehicles a movement point, per elevation level change, unless using a stairwell or a paved road. No air support is possible during overcast conditions, again for obvious reasons. So let's talk mud, everybody's favorite, general mud as the Russians call it. EC, not surprisingly, are always going to be mud. Fires will only spread to adjacent hexes if it's crossed by a building, woods, brush, grain, or orchard, and these are in-season orchards hexes. So if it's not a continuous wood line or a building, then the fires will not spread, unless a gust, of course, will make it jump. There is no road bonus on unpaved roads. Obviously, again, you can see there the horse and cart mired in the mud. There's no bonus at all on unpaved roads, which are, again, going to be most of your Russian village roads and such. The open ground movement cost of terrain is also going to be increased, half a movement factor or a movement point per hex side, unless you're entering a non-open ground terrain in that hex. So, for example, if you're entering a building, you just pay the normal 2 to enter the building. You wouldn't pay 2.5. Paved roads and runways are going to be unaffected by the presence of mud, and bog chances will always be increased, as is manhandling of guns. So when you have vehicles moving in open ground, you're going to have to take increased bog chances when you cross certain kinds of obstacles, as the terrain chart will indicate. Regarding HE attacks, these are only HE attacks, not HE equivalency, i.e. heat, in open ground. You get an extra +1 because of the cushioning effects of the soft ground. Any residual fire is going to be shifted one column over, and with the exception, of course, of those mines, airbursts, specific collateral attacks, any kind of direct fire ordnance versus the vehicles, including its passenger, riders, and crew, and or the pillbox and its occupants. Finally, is going to be a +1 to entrenching attempts. Now you can see there at the bottom the open ground definition. So for mud and deep snow only, open ground includes the following that you can see there. That's typically for HE attacks in open ground. So that when that applies, it changes the definition slightly for what open ground is. So you use that if you're firing HE attacks into any kind of open ground. Let's look at snow. Barring an SSR, you have to roll on the snow chart, which is to the left. You can see you can have different types, falling ground. You can have deep snow with falling snow, and you can even have extreme winter. Again, this is it's augmented by the Hakapala subarctic conditions. So depending what you're fighting, if you're fighting Finns versus Russians, example, early war, you may want to use that chart vice this one if you're designing your own games. Snow can exist in several forms and combinations, as you can see there, and falling snow will always be accompanied by overcast conditions. Now, it's the same die roll as per rain, so a 10 or better, snow start, 3 or less, snow stops. Again, if you roll a subsequent 10 or more while it's snowing, then you'll get heavy snow in effect, and the applicable low visibility hindrance will apply. Obviously, missed low visibility will be automatic, and EC are always going to be moist unless ground or deep snow are also present. For ground and deep snow, they share similar rules. There's some additions for deep snow, which we'll cover in a second. So basically, EC are always going to be wet, unless it's deep snow or extreme winter. Obviously, things will be frozen or frigid. Fires will only spread, much like with mud, across buildings, woods, and brush hexes if they're connected. And in deep snow, brush is actually turned into open ground, as is marsh and mud flats for ground and deep snow. Now, ground to deep snow will freeze all streams, and it does activate those Chapter B ice rules. And basically, it treats that as open ground. It'll still be a level below, unless, of course, it's a flooded river or pond, in which case it will be a higher level. Any entrenching in the snow is going to be suffering a +2 die roll, and you need a 5 or less to entrench, so it's already going to be hard enough. And obviously, if you've never tried to dig in the snow, which I have, it sucks. +1 movement factor per elevation change, unless you're using a plowed road or obviously a stairwell inside a building. And for vehicles, there's actually a minimum of 1 road entry cost, not half, regardless of your button up or not. And any non-tracked vehicles, with the exception being sledges, you must expend 1 extra movement point per hex site crossed and or bypassed. Now here's some additions to the deep snow. So HE attacks receive a +1 terrain effect per mud, as you can see again by the definition of open ground. Residual firepower will be reduced again as per mud, so it's reduced 1 column over, just for the softness of the deep snow. Any minefield attack and clearance die rolls receive a +1 DRM, and any AT mine factors are going to be reduced by 1. Obviously, if it's a 1 factor AT mine, then it's non-existent. Infantry cavalry will pay an extra half movement factor per hex side, and road bonus is only allowed, obviously, on plowed roads. And there's no galloping unless you're entirely on a plowed road. So if you're going to head cross country with your cavalry charge, you cannot gallop. Track vehicles pay that extra 1 movement factor per hex side. And non-tracked, again, the exception being sledges, will pay an extra 2 movement factors per hex side crossed. Obviously, bog and manhandling are going to be increased. And smoke rules are similar to mud, basically, unless it's entirely inside a building or from a blaze, it cannot exist. It just gets sucked up by the snow or blocked. Quick word on winter camouflage. So in any type of snow, any unit or vehicle specified as having winter camouflage will receive a +1 low visibility die roll modifier when fired at beyond 8 hexes of infantry or 16 if vehicle. Typically, this is only available by SSR, although by design your own, you could purchase this. And the exceptions, of course, to this low visibility hindrance are going to be OBA, any residual fire, and fire lanes. Obviously, those things don't care what you're wearing. They're just going to hit you regardless. It must be borne in mind that the +1 hindrance die roll modifier only applies if they do not qualify for any other positive terrain effect other than smoke. So for example, if you're height advantage, you don't get a +1. If you're inside a building, you don't get the +1 for camouflage. It's only open ground where you're not receiving any other positive terrain effect modifier. Finally, you get a -1 attempt DRM to your concealment. Let's look at extreme winter. Again, this will somewhat be augmented by the weather chart you can find in Chapter H under the fins. The results for extreme weather are the same, and just you have more of a chance of suffering this. Not a good time to be had by the troops. Again, you roll on the snow chart to determine the snow conditions. There's always going to be some kind of snow in extreme winter, obviously. EC are always going to be snow and all that that means. And if you're non-Finnish Axis personnel prior to 42, or if you're Russian prior to April 41, any roll of 11 or more on a rally attempt will equal casualty reduction, much in the way that fate is done. So if you roll a boxcars or an 11 in extreme weather and you fit those parameters, you're going to be suffering casualty reduction. All your breakdown numbers and disabled numbers are going to be decreased by 1 for pre-April 41 Russians and by 2 for pre-April 42 Axis. Again, the exceptions obviously are Finns. You cannot dig entrenchments. Ground's too frozen for that. Now that's just foxholes. You can still dig trenches because typically those are done by vehicle backhoes and dozers and such. And finally, with Axis vehicles, prior to April 42, any non-finish must make a die roll before expending a single start MP. And if you roll a 6 on that single die, then your vehicle is actually immobilized. So this roll is made before you expend any start MP, before you have to roll any breakdowns for red MPs, etc. You make this single die roll first, and if you roll a 6, your vehicle is going to become immobilized. All right, let's talk about snowdrifts. So snowdrifts occur at the start of a scenario by SSR, or again, if you're doing your design your own, you use that snow chart again from the previous slide to determine what kind of snow you have, deep or ground. And if any drifts are specified, each map board in play receives 6 drift counters. So for example, this SSR is from a Lone Canuck Publishing Gross Deutschland scenario, number 8, and it indicates that snowdrifts are in effect. So you look at your map boards, and each map board will receive 6 drift counters. You can also create further drift counters at the start of any rally phase, in which prior to the wind change die roll, any heavy winds or gusts were in force. And there's some combination of ground deep snow. Again, you'll be creating one per hex anytime those conditions are made. The way that they're placed, I'll show you an example in a second, but you look at your your drift counters, they're lettered, and you randomly pick one and you place it on coordinate number 5, and you do this for the other 5 drift counters, and then you do a random location die roll to move it around the board to see where it actually lands. If for your final location is off board, then that particular drift is gone, and any drifts placed on the board are faced in the direction the wind is blowing. Again, obviously, for you guys in the south, you may not experience a lot of snow drifts, but typically they pile up against fences and or houses, and just from the wind blowing in that direction. So it's always in the direction of the wind. So let's look at a quick example on how we do this. So we have a winterized map board. We've got our 6 drift counters sitting on the side. Now we place them. For me, I use the A to GG counter, and it's going to spit out a letter between A and GG eventually. So A is the first one, and we pick coordinate number 5. Z is the second one. We pick coordinate number 5, and you repeat the process for all your hexes. 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have one in M, which is a building, so we're going to have to move that one. We have a W, and then we have a C. Finally, H. No, I was actually wrong. It's not if it hits a building, it's if it's an interior building. So if you have a multi-hex building and, for example, it lands on the inside, obviously you would have to replace that one. So you put down your 6 counters, and now we do a random location die roll, much like for a sniper, to determine where it actually lands. So make it 2 die rolls, and we have a 3 and a 2. Let's use the one here on the right. So we have 3 for 2. Again, 1, 2, 3. So it goes this way. This one here, we have 6 for 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, so that's going to be off board. Next, we go 4 for 3, 1, 2, 3, and we keep going like this for all the counters. So we have 6 for 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then lastly, we have 6 for 3. A lot of 6s there. All right, now once we're in this location, we have to determine which way the wind is blowing. So for our purposes, we'll quickly throw on a wind counter. And we'll just use the wind as it comes off the Vassal thing there, and then you just rotate your drift counter until it points down to the direction that the wind is blowing. Should be one more. All right, if you have no wind, for example, and then for each one you would just make a die roll. Let's use one at the north. So we rotate this one for 3. Let's go 1, 2, 3, and so forth. And you do that for that way. So if there's no wind direction given in the SSR, or you're doing a design your own, you still have to roll randomly for the direction for each of the drifts. And that's where your drift starts. Now with the creation, for further creation, say you have a wind change and it now becomes mild breeze or heavy breeze, then you start adding more drift counters in the same fashion. You pick one randomly from your list of the unavailable use counters. You do a location for it. And again, you repeat the process. So D5, random location die roll. We're going to 4 for 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one just doesn't want to play. And again, it has to face the direction of the wind that is blowing. And that's how you place snowdrifts. And there we have it, a quick 30-minute or so video on weather. It's not really complex except for maybe the drift procedure. It's basically read along and follow the rules. Remember your low visibility hindrances, how they apply. I didn't cover it, but it's rather obvious that if you're inside an interior building, if you're firing to another hex of an adjacent building hex and you're in that same building, then obviously none of these weather conditions are going to apply to you. The weather's always going to be clear from your perspective. And the last thing I'll mention is any of these incremental movement factor, movement point cost that are incurred for crossing drifts or snow or what have you, muddy roads. You add up everything and then you add these into addition. So for example, if you're going to reverse into terrain, you don't add it and then quadruple the amount for reverse into terrain. You would do your reverse into terrain, then you would add 1 for moving into the mud or snow, what have you. So yeah, just a quick brief overview of the weather rules. Most of this is defined by SSR, so it's really out of your hands. You just have to know how to apply those rules. One thing that Dave and I found out, we had a scenario, Stirling Castle, and we had some Germans attacking up a hill, and we had to deal with rain. First time ever any of us had to do this, and all that entails. Going up a hill, obviously you start increasing how much it starts to cost you in terms of movement points, so it's made it much more challenging to have that. And when you have mist and when you have fog, again, these are challenges that can either aid you or hinder you in your attempt, depending on which side that is doing what, I suppose. Generally speaking, this we're talking inclement weather is the bad guy, mud, mist, rain, and snow, that kind of stuff. And that'll be that. So if you have any questions on weather, any clarifications that I can answer, I'll try and get to that in the comments section. So feel free to knock it out down below. And again, anything Pacific and or desert related, we're going to save for those venues when we do those chapters, which I have a good feeling I think I'm going to be doing those at some point in the future, probably when we get around to playing PTO especially. So that's enough for me, enough babbling, and we'll see you guys in the next video.